The sun had just begun to rise, painting the horizon with strokes of orange and gold. The waves lapped softly against the old wooden boats tied loosely to the dock. In a small coastal village, where life moved slower than the tide itself, lived a fisherman named Matteo. His hair had grayed early, not from age alone, but from years of rising before dawn, of long days under the blazing sun, and of endless nights listening to the sea's lullaby. Matteo was not wealthy, nor was he poor. He lived in a modest hut by the shore, with his wife and 2 children. His life was simple: catch enough fish for the day, sell what was needed at the market, and return home before nightfall. To outsiders, his life looked ordinary, even uneventful. But to Matteo, every sunrise was a gift, every meal with his family was a blessing, and every laugh of his children was worth more than gold. One morning, as he prepared his nets, a well-dressed businessman visiting from the city approached him. The man looked at Matteo with curiosity. "Why do you fish only a few hours each day?" he asked. "If you worked longer, you could catch more fish, sell them, and earn more money. With more money, you could buy bigger boats, hire more men, and expand your business. One day, you could own a fleet." Matteo listened patiently. His hands kept working on the nets, untangling the ropes, as he hummed a tune his father once sang to him. Finally, he looked up with calm eyes and replied, and after that, the businessman, encouraged, continued, "Then you would be rich. You could retire early, live in comfort, spend your days with your family, enjoy the sea without worry." Matteo smiled gently and pointed toward the small hut behind him, where his wife was preparing breakfast and his children were chasing each other in the sand. "But I already do all of that." He realized that the fisherman's wealth was not measured in coins, but in moments of love, laughter, and peace. Matteo returned to mending his nets, humming again. The waves whispered against the shore, as if agreeing with him. The value of time is not in how much we fill it with work, but in how we choose to live it. That morning, the story of the fisherman began to ripple beyond the village, carrying with it a lesson that would change lives. The businessman's silence lingered long after Matteo had spoken. For the first time in years, he found himself without an immediate answer. He was a man of plans, of strategies, of profit margins, and projections. Yet here, standing on the simple sands of the fishing village, he was faced with a truth that gnawed at the very structure of his thinking. He tried again, almost defensively, "But surely, you must want more. Don't you ever dream of having a bigger house, more clothes, more possessions? Don't you want to send your children to the finest schools? Don't you want security?" Matteo placed his net aside. He looked out at the sea, the same sea he had trusted all his life. The waves were steady, rolling endlessly to the shore. And with each one came a quiet reminder. Life had its rhythm, and forcing it to run faster never changed its song. "My children are already learning what they need to learn," he said gently, "not just from books, but from life itself. They know how to laugh at little things, how to respect the sea, how to be kind to others. My wife and I give them love every day, and that is a wealth no school can teach. As for security, it is not in how much I store, but in how much I trust. If today I have food, if today I have health, if today I have love, then today I am secure. The businessman frowned, frustrated but also strangely moved. But don't you want to be remembered? To leave behind something bigger? Matteo chuckled softly. His eyes, crinkled with age and sunlight, glowed with a peace that the businessman could not understand. Remembered. My children will remember me in the way I hold their hands, in the songs I sing them at night, in the stories I tell them about the sea. My wife will remember me in every shared meal, every smile, every silent evening watching the sunset together. Do I need more than that? The businessman looked around. The village was quiet, the houses small and modest, yet there was laughter echoing in the air, children playing, mothers calling, fishermen greeting one another. It was a kind of wealth he had never paused long enough to see. He thought of his own life in the city, the tall apartment with glass walls, the fast cars, the expensive suits, the endless meetings, the rush to be the first, the best, the richest. He thought of the nights he spent alone in a vast apartment, eating reheated meals, with the glow of his laptop as his only company. He thought of the time he hadn't seen his parents in years, of the childhood friends whose calls he had ignored, of the laughter he had traded for late-night deadlines. The sea breeze brushed against him, carrying the faint smell of salt and wood. For the first time in years, he felt a quiet ache inside his chest. Could it be that this fisherman, this man with no riches, no fleets, no power, was living a life far greater than his own? Matteo noticed the shift in his expression and said softly, "You see, Senor, time is not measured by clocks. It is measured by moments. And if you spend all your hours chasing more, you may wake up one day and realize you already had enough, but lost the chance to enjoy it." The businessman looked down at his polished shoes sinking slightly in the sand. The waves rolled in and out, as if marking the seconds of a different kind of clock, one not bound by deadlines or profit, but by the rhythm of life itself. For the first time in years, he did not know what to say. That evening, as the sun melted into the horizon and painted the sky in shades of crimson and gold, the businessman found himself unable to leave the shore. He was scheduled to travel back to the city the next morning, yet something held him there, a pull, like an anchor buried deep in the sand of his thoughts. He had spent his life believing he was ahead of everyone else. He had graduated from prestigious schools, built a successful career, owned property, investments, cars, and stocks. To the world, he was living the dream. Yet in this little fishing village, surrounded by men who owned nothing more than nets, wooden boats, and a handful of coins, he felt something stir inside him, strange emptiness he could no longer ignore. That night, unable to sleep, he wandered through the village. The houses were small, with roofs patched by hand, doors creaking with age, and windows glowing warmly from candlelight. He could hear laughter, families gathered around meals, children giggling as their mothers tucked them in, elders telling stories of storms survived and seas conquered. The businessman realized that in his own life, silence often filled the spaces where laughter should have been. His nights were drowned in emails and deadlines, not in warmth or love. His successes came at the cost of time, the very thing these villagers seemed to value most. He paused at the fisherman's hut. From the open window, he saw Matteo sitting with his children. One child was curled in his lap, the other resting against his shoulder. As Matteo told a story about the sea, a tale of storms, of courage, of how his father once saved a drifting boat in the middle of the night. His wife was there too, smiling softly, her hands busy weaving a small net, but her ears fully tuned to every word. The businessman stood frozen outside the window, the scene piercing him like a blade. He thought of his own father, who had passed away years ago. He had not been there in the final days, too busy chasing contracts. He thought of the woman he once loved but let slip away because he was too focused on his career. He thought of all the stories he never told, the dinners he never attended, the hugs he never gave. The tears came before he could stop them. Quietly, he stepped away, ashamed, but also awakened. For the first time, he asked himself a question he had always avoided. What if I've been wrong? The next morning, Matteo found him sitting by the shore, watching the sunrise. His suit jacket lay on the sand beside him, and his polished shoes were off, his bare feet sinking into the cool, wet earth. You didn't sleep, Matteo said with a knowing smile. The businessman shook his head, staring at the waves. I thought I knew what life was about. I thought happiness was in building more, owning more, becoming more. But last night, I saw something I haven't felt in years. Peace, love, belonging. I don't have any of that. Matteo sat beside him, silent for a moment. Then he spoke with a voice as steady as the tide. We all chase something, Senor. Some chase coins, some chase comfort, some chase dreams. But if you chase too fast, you may lose what is already in your hands. The businessman turned to him, his voice cracking. But I can't stop now. If I stop, won't I fall behind? Won't I lose everything I worked for? Matteo picked up a handful of wet sand and let it slip slowly through his fingers. Look at this sand. The tighter you grip it, the more it escapes. But if you let it rest in your palm, it stays. Time is the same. Life is the same. You cannot grip it too hard, or it will slip away. The businessman closed his eyes, letting those words sink deep. For once, he wasn't thinking about profits or deadlines or investments. He was thinking about something he hadn't thought of in years, what it meant to live, not just exist. And as the waves whispered around them, for the first time, the cracks in the city man's armor began to widen. The next few days stretched into something unexpected. The businessman, who had planned to return to the city the very next morning, found himself lingering in the village. It was not intentional, at least, not at first. He told himself he was only observing, studying, curious about the fisherman's simple philosophy. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. Something inside him wanted to stay. Matteo welcomed him without question. He treated him not as a stranger, but as if he had always been a part of the community. On the second day, Matteo invited him onto his small wooden boat. It was a modest vessel, worn by the sea and patched in places, but steady. The businessman hesitated at first, looking at the rough planks, so different from the polished perfection he was used to. But he climbed in anyway. As the boat drifted out into the open sea, silence filled the space between them. The waves rocked gently. The morning sun painted golden ripples across the water, and seabirds circled overhead. Matteo cast his net with practiced ease, his movements slow and deliberate. You don't hurry, he observed. Every move seems calm. Matteo smiled. The sea doesn't rush, Senor. It gives when it wants to give. If you pull too hard, you break the net. If you wait too little, you miss the catch. Fishing teaches patience, life teaches the same. For hours they fished together. Matteo told stories of storms that had tested his courage, of nights when the sea was generous and others when it gave nothing. But in every story, the lesson was the same. Life could not be forced. It had to be lived in rhythm, in trust. By midday, they returned with enough fish to feed Matteo's family and to sell at the market. The businessman expected him to go back out again, to maximize the catch. But instead, Matteo tied the boat, slung the fish over his shoulder, and walked home whistling. "You're done," the businessman asked in disbelief. "But you could earn more today." Matteo stopped, turning to him with a kind smile. "Earn more for what? To miss lunch with my children, to lose the laughter at my table. Money is useful, yes, but it is not worth the hours I cannot get back." The words cut through the businessman like a blade. He thought of his own life, where meals were often eaten alone, and laughter was replaced with the cold glow of screens. He thought of his house filled with objects, but empty of joy. That evening, he joined Matteo's family for dinner. They sat on the floor, the air filled with the smell of grilled fish and wood smoke. The children spoke excitedly about their day, their small hands reaching eagerly for food. His wife listened patiently, her eyes glowing with love as she served everyone before herself. The hut was simple, no fancy decorations, no expensive furniture, but it was filled with something he realized he had never truly known: warmth. As the children finished eating, Matteo's wife brought out a small instrument and began to play a soft tune. Matteo sang, his voice rough but full of soul, and soon the children joined in. The businessman sat there, silent, watching. He didn't know the words, but he felt them in his chest. It was a language of belonging, of time well spent, of life fully lived. Later, as the stars spilled across the night sky, Matteo turned to him and asked, "Tell me, Senor, when was the last time you ate with your family, not in silence, but with joy?" The businessman tried to answer, but the words caught in his throat. He realized he couldn't remember. Not last year, not the year before, maybe not for decades. That night, lying on a simple mat that Matteo offered him, with the sounds of the sea lulling him to sleep, the businessman felt something unusual: peace. For once, he did not think about tomorrow's meetings or profits. He thought only of the fisherman's words: "Time is not measured by clocks, but by moments." And for the first time in years, he prayed silently, not for wealth, not for success, but for time. The businessman awoke the next morning to the sound of waves and birdsong instead of the shrill alarm clock he was used to. For the first time in years, he hadn't slept with his phone by his side. He hadn't checked emails, hadn't scrolled through stock updates, hadn't been interrupted by late-night calls. Instead, he had fallen asleep to the rhythm of the ocean and woken up feeling human. He walked outside, the sand cool beneath his bare feet. Matteo was already by the shore, preparing his boat. His children chased each other in the morning light, their laughter carrying across the water like music. The businessman stood there, watching, a strange heaviness filling his chest. It was not sadness alone, it was the weight of realization. He thought of his own children, grown now, living lives of their own. He had given them money, education, and every material comfort they could ask for. But had he given them himself? Had he been present? He could barely remember the last time he had played with them on a beach, or laughed with them over a simple meal. Memories that should have been full of warmth were instead marked by absence. That day, he accompanied Matteo to the market. The village was alive with chatter, vendors calling out, children weaving through the crowds, neighbors exchanging greetings. Matteo sold his fish quickly, not bargaining for every last coin, but accepting what was fair. When the businessman asked why he didn't fight for more, Matteo simply said, "Fairness is worth more than profit. A good name is better than a heavy purse." The businessman paused at those words. In his world, deals were about winning, outsmarting, taking more. Fairness had been a weakness, generosity a flaw. And yet, here was a man respected by everyone around him, not because he had more, but because he gave enough. As they walked back, the businessman noticed how many people greeted Matteo by name, how many stopped to ask about his family, how many children ran to him with smiles. Matteo knew them all, their joys and sorrows alike. He was woven into the very fabric of the village, not as a wealthy man, but as a man of value. That evening, the businessman sat with Matteo on the shore, watching the sunset turn the sky into fire. He finally spoke the words that had been pressing against his heart. "I thought I lived wisely. I thought my success meant I had done everything right. But now I see I may have traded years of life for things that don't last. I've lost time with people I love. I've lost myself." Matteo listened quietly, his eyes on the horizon. Then he turned and said softly, "Senor, regret is a heavy net, but even a heavy net can be lifted if you choose. The sea forgives every day. It does not ask what storms you survived yesterday. It only asks what you will do with today's tide." The businessman felt tears burn his eyes. He thought of all the dinners he had missed, the birthdays absent from, the phone calls unanswered. He thought of the time he had wasted chasing more, when what he needed was already within reach. For a long time, he sat in silence, the weight of years pressing down on him. But slowly, the words of the fisherman sank into his soul. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe he could still choose differently. Maybe time, though lost in some places, could still be redeemed in others. The waves whispered against the shore, and for the first time in his life, the businessman began to wonder not how much more he could gain, but how much better he could live. The businessman stayed longer than he intended. Each day in the village peeled away another layer of the life he thought he understood. One morning, instead of rushing with Matteo to the shore, he stayed behind with the children. They showed him how to skip stones across the waves, how to carve small boats out of driftwood, how to laugh without reason. At first, he felt clumsy, out of place, a man untrained in the art of play. But slowly, as their laughter echoed around him, something inside began to loosen. He laughed too, an honest, unguarded laugh he hadn't heard from himself in years. Later that day, he helped Matteo repair his fishing net. His soft hands, used to typing on keyboards and signing papers, fumbled with the rough rope. But Matteo's patience guided him. "Every knot matters," the fisherman said. "If one knot is weak, the whole net breaks. Life is the same. Every small choice matters." The businessman carried those words with him. That night, while lying under the stars, he thought about the knots of his own life moments when he had chosen work over love, ambition over peace, greed over fairness. But now, he wondered, What if he started tying better knots, even if small? What if he could still weave strength into what remained of his years? Each sunrise brought new lessons. He ate slowly instead of rushing. He listened more than he spoke. He even joined the villagers in helping mend a roof after a storm, his polished shoes abandoned in the sand. His expensive watch no longer guided his hours. The tide and sun did, and little by little the heaviness he carried began to lighten. The days rolled gently into weeks, and the businessman who once measured his worth by deals closed and numbers rising found himself breathing differently. The rhythm of the sea had replaced the ticking of clocks, yet deep inside he felt a pull, a restless voice reminding him that his world, the city, the empire he built, was still waiting. He stood at a crossroads, two worlds tugging at him. One evening, he sat on the shore beside Matteo. The sky was painted in streaks of gold and violet, the last colors of the sun stretching across the horizon. The children played in the distance, their laughter rising above the sound of the waves. For a long while, both men said nothing. Finally, the businessman broke the silence. "Matteo," he said, his voice softer than it had been in years, "I don't know what to do. Back home, everything is waiting, my company, my wealth, but when I'm here, I feel alive, as if I've been sleeping for years and only just woke up." Matteo smiled faintly. "The sea teaches us that you cannot sail in two directions at once. You must choose your wind. But remember, whatever choice you make, you pay its price. Time is the only currency we never get back." The words stung him with truth. That night, the businessman lay awake. He thought of his towering office windows, the long boardroom tables, the sharp suits, and endless flights. He also thought of the fishermen's fires, the warm meals, the freedom of the ocean breeze. Which life was real? Which one was worth living? The next morning, as if the universe sensed his confusion, he received a letter. A villager had come running with it, saying a courier had traveled days to deliver. The letter was from his assistant back in the city. It spoke of crises, partners growing impatient, rivals circling like vultures, projects collapsing without his leadership. His empire was trembling, waiting for him to return. The letter shook him. His heart raced with the old rhythm of urgency. He felt needed again, important. Yet when he looked up from the paper, he saw Matteo's wife serving breakfast while humming a gentle tune, her hands graceful, her face glowing with calm. He saw the children chasing each other barefoot, unburdened by anything except joy. For hours, he walked alone by the cliffs. The ocean roared below, and he thought about his own roar, loud in the world of business, feared by competitors. But here, that roar meant nothing. Here, the sea roared louder, reminding him of his smallness. Which life is success? He whispered to himself. Is it building towers of wealth, or building moments that cannot be bought? When he returned to the village, he found Matteo waiting. The fisherman handed him a small shell, smooth and spiraled. "This is for you," Matteo said. "Keep it as a reminder. Even the smallest shell carries the voice of the sea inside it. So will you, wherever you go." The businessman held the shell tightly, fighting the storm within his heart. That evening, he joined the villagers around a fire. For the first time, he played music with them, clapping and singing without care. For a brief moment, he belonged. Yet, in the back of his mind, the city still called. The crossroads had never been clearer, He could return and repair his empire, or he could stay and repair his soul. The following days became the most restless of the businessman's life. He felt as if he were standing between two tides, one pulling him back to the city with its noise, wealth, and recognition, and the other urging him to stay in this quiet village, where the sea whispered truths no skyscraper could ever teach. He woke early one morning before sunrise, unable to sleep. The world was still, the sky barely glowing, and the waves rolled endlessly, as though they had secrets only the patient could understand. He walked down to the shore where Matteo was already mending his nets. The fisherman looked up and smiled, as if he had been expecting him. "You look troubled, my friend," Matteo said calmly, threading rope through the net's holes. "I feel torn in half," the businessman admitted. "Back home, everything I built is falling apart without me. But here, I feel whole. I don't know which life to choose. If I return, I'll lose this peace. If I stay, I'll lose everything I worked for." Matteo set down the net. "Listen," he said softly. "The sea does not argue with itself. It does not say, 'Should I be calm or should I be wild?' It simply is. The waves come and go. The tide rises and falls. That is its truth. You must ask yourself, what is your truth? Who are you, without the noise of the city or the silence of the sea?" The words dug deep into the businessman's heart. He had spent so many years chasing success that he had forgotten to ask who he truly was. Later that day, the villagers gathered for a celebration. A child had been born, and the whole community came together to honor the new life. The businessman watched in awe as neighbors shared food, laughter, and music. No one checked the time. No one hurried away. Every face glowed with joy, as if nothing in the world mattered more than that single evening. He thought about his own life in the city, the meetings, the deals, the rush. He thought of birthdays missed, dinners skipped, and nights spent staring at glowing screens. He realized that in all his years of chasing wealth, he had never celebrated life itself the way these villagers did every single day. That night, unable to shake the turmoil inside him, he climbed the cliffs overlooking the ocean. The moonlight spilled across the water, silver and endless. He took out the letter from his assistant, the one warning of chaos in his company. He read it again and again, the words blurring in the pale light. Then, with trembling hands, he also took out the small shell Matteo had given him. He held both the letter and the shell, one in each hand. On one side was his empire, powerful, fragile, demanding. On the other was a reminder of simplicity, of time, of the voice of the sea. For hours he stood there, torn between the two worlds. He thought of the fortune he had built, the respect he commanded, the influence he wielded. Then he thought of the laughter of Matteo's children, the warmth of shared meals, the peace of mornings without clocks. Tears filled his eyes as he whispered into the wind, "What is the true value of my life?" The sea answered with its eternal roar, and for the first time in decades, the businessman felt small not in defeat, but in clarity. He realized he had been measuring life by the wrong scales. Money, power, recognition, none of them could buy back the time he had already lost. The decision came not as a sudden spark, but as a gentle surrender, like the tide finally reaching the shore. He folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his pocket. Then he placed the shell against his ear, letting the sound of the sea fill him. The choice was clear now. The next morning, he told Matteo, "I will return to the city," he said, his voice steady, "but not to rebuild what I lost. I will go back to end it properly, to free myself from it. And then I will come back here, to live the life I never knew I wanted." Matteo smiled, not surprised. "The sea always brings a man back to his truth," he said. For the first time, the businessman felt light. The burden of chasing more had finally loosened its grip. He realized that success was not in having everything, but in knowing what truly mattered and giving it your time. And so, with the sunrise, a new chapter of his life began. When the businessman finally boarded the ship back to the mainland, the horizon seemed heavier than before. The sea behind him whispered of freedom and simplicity, but the skyline ahead promised a storm. He carried only a small bag with him, some clothes, a notebook, and the seashell Matteo had given him. Everything else, his vast fortune, his possessions, and his empire, was waiting in the city, clinging to him like chains he hadn't yet broken. The ship's journey was long, and with each passing day he felt the noise of the modern world creeping back into his veins. He heard conversations of travelers bragging about deals, deadlines, and success stories. Once, he might have joined them proudly, but now their words sounded hollow, like a chorus of clocks ticking loudly in a silent room. He touched the shell in his pocket, reminding himself of what he had learned, that time was not to be wasted in endless pursuit of things that never lasted. When he arrived, the city overwhelmed him. Neon lights flickered, cars roared, phones buzzed, and billboards screamed about products and promises of happiness. He stood still at the station, watching people rush past him, every face locked in its own urgency. No one noticed the sunrise that was spilling gold across the skyscrapers. No one stopped to breathe. It was a world of running feet, running clocks, and running lives. He made his way to his company's headquarters, a glass tower that seemed to pierce the sky itself. Once it had been his pride, a monument to his hard work and ambition. Now it looked more like a cage, a crystal prison trapping thousands of people in cycles of endless work. His assistant, Thomas, met him in the lobby, panic etched across his tired face. "Sir." "Finally, you're here," Thomas said breathlessly. "The board is furious. Investors are threatening to pull out. We need to act immediately, or everything you've built will collapse." The businessman listened quietly, letting the words wash over him. Once, those words would have ignited adrenaline in his veins. Now, they only felt heavy. He nodded and followed Thomas up to the boardroom. Inside, chaos ruled. The directors shouted, argued, pointed fingers, and threw blame like arrows. Charts flashed on screens, numbers danced in red, and predictions of failure hung over the room like storm clouds. When they saw him, the room hushed. For years, his presence had been enough to command silence, respect, even fear. But this time, he wasn't here to fight for control. He was here to let go. He raised his hand and spoke. His voice was calm, almost too calm for the storm around him. "I have returned," he said, "but not to save this empire. I came to close it." The board, gasps, protests, and furious whispers filled the air. "Close it? Are you mad?" one director shouted. "You'll ruin your legacy," another cried. But the businessman continued, unwavering. "For years, I believed this company defined me. I thought the hours I spent here were an investment, a sacrifice worth making. But the truth is I was paying with the only currency I'll never get back, time. And time is life itself. I will not spend another second trapped in this illusion. The directors tried to argue, to convince him of the billions at stake, the reputation he would destroy, the opportunities he was wasting. But he only shook his head. "What good is reputation," he said softly, "if it costs you your soul? What good is wealth if it robs you of moments with family, friends, with yourself?" I built towers, but I never built memories. I gained riches, but I lost time, and I will not lose any more. The silence that followed was heavy. For the first time, even the most hardened investors had no words. His decision was final, and they knew it. In the weeks that followed, he began dismantling his empire. He sold off assets, closed unnecessary branches, and distributed shares among his employees. Many were shocked, some were angry, but others quietly thanked him. They, too, had given too much of their lives to the machine of endless work. The media exploded with headlines. Some called him a fool, others a visionary. Interviews were requested, but he refused them all. For once, he didn't want to explain himself to the world. He only wanted to live, but leaving wasn't as easy as he thought. Every day, he fought against the pull of old habits, the temptation to check numbers, the urge to control outcomes, the fear of losing everything he once valued. The city itself seemed to mock him with reminders of who he had been. Restaurants with plaques bearing his name, skyscrapers with his company's logo, people whispering about his downfall as he walked by one night. As he sat alone in his penthouse, he looked out over the glittering city. From up high, the traffic looked like rivers of fire, endless and restless. He thought of Mateo's village, where the only lights at night were stars and lanterns. He felt the weight of loneliness press down on him. But then, he took out the seashell. He placed it against his ear and closed his eyes. The faint echo of the sea filled him, and with it came peace. He remembered Mateo's words. The sea always brings a man back to his truth. Slowly he began to find balance. He reconnected with his estranged family, visiting his aging parents, apologizing to his sister for years of neglect. He spent time walking in parks, observing the laughter of children and the beauty of sunsets, things he once dismissed as distractions. He volunteered at shelters, spoke to young entrepreneurs, not about money, but about balance, about not letting life slip away. The city didn't change, but he had. And as the weeks turned into months, the storm inside him quieted, finally. After finishing the last of the company's closures, he packed his bag again. But this time, he packed less, a few clothes, a journal, and the shell. He left behind the suits, the watches, the luxury. He booked a one-way ticket back to the coast, back to Mateo's world. When the villagers saw him again, they welcomed him not as a businessman, but as a friend. He helped mend nets, learned to sail the small boats, and shared meals under starlit skies. He was clumsy at first, unused to such simple tasks, but laughter replaced judgment. For the first time in his life, he felt human, not as a title or a brand, but as a man. And so, he chose not to live by clocks anymore. He rose with the sun, rested with the night, and let each day unfold as it came. Time was no longer his enemy, nor his master. It was his companion, his teacher, his gift. Yet deep inside, he knew one thing still remained unfinished. He had to share what he had learned, not as advice, but as a story, because perhaps someone, somewhere, still rushing through life, might hear his words and stop before it was too late. He opened his journal one evening, the sea breeze carrying the scent of salt and freedom, and he began to write not about numbers or deals, but about the value of time, the lesson of a fisherman, and the truth he had almost lost forever. And with every word, he felt lighter. The sea was quiet that evening. The waves whispered against the shore like an old friend telling secrets, and the fisherman's lantern flickered softly in the distance, a lone flame against the wide horizon. The businessman, no, not a businessman anymore, just a man who had shed the weight of titles and ambitions, sat on the sand, notebook in hand. The years of rushing, of running, of endlessly chasing the next milestone now seemed like a dream, a life lived by someone else. He dipped his pen into ink and began to write, each word flowing not with effort but with truth, like the tide returning faithfully to the shore. He wrote about the first day he had arrived in the village. How strange it had felt to watch a man fish for a few hours and then return home to laugh and sing with his family. He remembered the questions that had burned in him, then questions of money, growth, expansion, of what more could be gained. But now he smiled at his own blindness. How much time had he wasted thinking wealth was measured in coins instead of moments? How many nights had he spent in glass towers while life unfolded in the streets below, in the laughter of children, in the warmth of shared meals, in the silence of starlit skies? He wrote of his return to the city, the boardroom filled with shouting men, the empire he had chosen to dissolve, the empire he had once thought was his life. He described the looks on their faces, the disbelief, the anger, the fear. He remembered the silence after his words. What good is wealth if it robs you of time? And he knew even then that silence meant something had shifted, if only slightly. Perhaps a seed had been planted. Perhaps someone else in that room, or someone who heard the story later, would pause before sacrificing another year of life to the god of endless ambition. The lantern light swayed, and he lifted his head to watch Matteo, the fisherman, pulling in his nets. He had not changed, still simple, still steady, still anchored in the rhythm of tide and wind. Yet, to the man watching, Matteo was not simple at all. He was profound, a teacher cloaked in humility, a guardian of truths that the world had long forgotten. The man remembered one of the fisherman's sayings, "Every day is a coin. You can spend it on noise or on meaning, but once spent, it never returns." How blind he had been to that wisdom! How many coins had he spent on noise? How many had he wasted in the echo of boardrooms, chasing applause that never filled the emptiness inside? But he could not change the past. What he could do was honor the present, and so he wrote not for himself, but for whoever would read his words long after he was gone. He wrote for the young who still believed time was infinite, for the old who regretted what was lost, for the dreamers trapped in offices, for the parents missing their children's laughter, for the lonely who thought success might cure emptiness. He wrote to tell them what he had learned too late, that time is not money, time is life. The waves rose and fell, and the night deepened. He kept writing. He wrote about walking barefoot along the sand, about learning to mend nets with hands once too soft for labor, about tasting meals made not with luxury but with love, about laughter that healed wounds no medicine could touch. He wrote about rediscovering his family, about apologies spoken with tears, about holding his mother's fragile hand and realizing that even a billionaire could not buy another hour of her presence. He wrote of silence, of peace, of mornings where the first sound was not a buzzing phone but birds greeting the sun. And the more he wrote, the more he felt the weight lift from him, as though each word returned another stolen moment to his heart. When dawn came, he closed the notebook. The sky was painted with strokes of orange and pink, and for a moment he felt as if the world itself was reminding him of the truth. Every sunrise is a gift, every day a treasure, every moment a chance to choose differently. The fisherman approached, carrying his modest catch, and sat beside him. They said nothing for a while, listening to the sea breathe. Finally, the man turned to his friend and said, "Matteo, I think I understand now. Time is not something to be managed. It is something to be honored, to be lived." Matteo smiled, lines of salt and sun etched deeply into his face. "You've learned what many never do. Time is not in the clock. It is in the heart, and the heart always knows when it has enough." The man nodded. He had once thought he needed more money, more buildings, more power, more recognition. But now he knew the truth. Enough was not in numbers. Enough was in moments. Enough was in laughter. Enough was in love. He decided then that his wealth would not be remembered in skyscrapers or bank accounts, but in stories that might reach someone still lost in the maze of ambition. Stories that might save someone else years of regret. Stories that might remind the world that the richest man is not the one with the most, but the one who knows when he has enough. As the years passed, he lived quietly in the village, writing, teaching, and living. Travelers sometimes came, seeking advice from the man who had once been powerful, who had abandoned his empire. They expected strategies, secrets, formulas for success. Instead, he offered them tea, a seat by the sea, and silence. And in that silence, they too began to hear the voice of time, the gentle, urgent whisper that said, "Live now." One evening, long after he had grown old, a young boy asked him, "What is the most valuable thing you ever owned?" The old man smiled, placing the seashell into the boy's hand. "This," he said, "because it reminds me of the sea, and the sea reminds me of time, and time reminds me of life, is everything." When he finally closed his eyes for the last time, he did so not with regret but with peace. The sea sang him to sleep, the waves carrying his story far beyond the shore. 2 cities and villages, 2 boardrooms and bedrooms, to the hearts of those who needed it most. And his final lesson echoed like the tide, endless and unbroken. The true measure of life is not in years, nor in wealth, nor in achievements. It is in moments well lived. Honor your time. Cherish it, because once it is gone, nothing, not money, not power, not even prayer can bring it back. Time is the gift. Time is the treasure. Time is the story. Spend it wisely. The sea swallowed his words, but it also carried them. And somewhere, even now, someone pauses, breathes, and chooses differently, because a fisherman once lived simply. because a man once listened, because the truth was never about money. It was always about time.